What's going to happen? What's coming next? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? These are questions that any person and organization must constantly wrestle with. It's keenly necessary to prepare for what lies ahead, but absent a soothsayer, it's going to be difficult to know for sure what that will be. Not to mention that people aren't always a fan of future predictions. Just look at Cassandra. So, how can we make informed decisions about the future without knowing what it will be? Well, I'm here to tell you that today. And by the end of this talk, you too will be able to imagine what the future of your work and life may look like, and hopefully not end up in the kind of Greek tragedy that she did. The field of futurism, or future studies, or strategic foresight, has been around for about half a century. First, let me emphasize that it is not risk or trend analysis, nor is it the projection of facts, situations, and variables that we're already aware of. Those methodologies attempt to extrapolate quantitative data, usually over a fairly short-term period. However, as new events invariably change the landscape, those trends will become less and less accurate. Futurism, by contrast, helps us to consider new factors, new possibilities, entirely new worlds that enable us to imagine these new trends. Futurist Cecily Sommers identifies changes in governance, demographics, technology, and resources as the 4 major forces or drivers that cause emerging new trends. This is a good framework for zooming out from a particular issue and seeing the forest for the trees. As for how futurism actually works, there are several major steps of the whole future visioning process, ranging from first framing the issue you want to explore through putting your plan into action. This talk will focus on the forecasting step, but this begs the question, what exactly do people forecast? Well, if any of you have heard of Nassim Taleb's black swan, that is his name for big, usually unforeseen events that are punctuated disequilibria. They cause a sudden and complete shift in the world, and nothing is the same afterwards. Consider events like the Holocaust, the internet, the financial crisis, I'm not supposed to talk about that. Despite the impact of these events, we don't see them on any standard economic projection. But why is that? Well, like most pithy responses, the answer is best expressed in the form of a parable. Taleb tells the story of a turkey on a farm who is fed and cared for every day. The turkey is safe and comfortable, so it graphs data points tracking its well-being over time and does a basic regression analysis to get the line we see here. This is a smart turkey. Using this regression, the turkey assumes that its well-being will only get better, and now it's Thanksgiving. The turkey was smart, but not smart enough. It assumed that a data trend would last indefinitely, not changing in any significant way. But let's have some sympathy for the turkey. Not only did it suffer a fate that none of its previous data ever suggested was on the table, so to speak, but like us, the turkey has a bias towards the status quo. This is a cognitive bias that causes us to prefer our current situation and perceive change as a negative. Now, there are good evolutionary reasons for us to ensure that our lives stay consistent on a day-to-day basis, but if we're fearful of any sort of change, we can't consider how potentially radical our future may be. If the turkey had done so, perhaps it could have foreseen that its fortunes may change, escaped the farm, and starred in the world's highest-grossing stop-motion feature film. If that's any indication, we stand to benefit significantly from overcoming status quo bias and imagining the future broadly and honestly. Let's talk about Shell, the oil company, who started using this kind of forecasting in the early 70s. In 1973, a futurist working there named Pierre Wack developed the unimaginatively named 1973 scenarios. This enabled Shell to consider the possibility of an oil shortage. No other company was incorporating this sort of perspective into their strategic thinking at the time, but because Shell did, they sold certain refineries, decided not to replace others, and ultimately weathered the crisis fairly well. They're still using futurism over 40 years later. It feels like a pretty good philosophy to me. If that didn't convince you, let me show you a report that the McKinsey Global Institute just published earlier this year. It tracked the revenue and investment patterns of 615 publicly listed companies over a 15-year period, and it found that those with longer-term views had greater revenue than the others. They consistently invested in their workforce and their R&D, even during the financial crisis. So, to paraphrase, mo future, mo money. And fewer problems. Yet, despite this, short-term thinking actually experienced a net increase during this period. Many other companies reacted to the financial crisis in the opposite manner. They placed more short-term pressures on their managers and directors to the detriment of their financials and culture. Make no mistake, long-term thinking isn't just a preferable or better option. In today's world, it's a truly necessary one. So why don't more people do it? Well, among other reasons, taking this kind of perspective requires a certain type of thinking. According to futurists Andy Hines and Peter Bishop, there are several major attitude adjustments required to be an effective futurist. These include understanding your biases, considering complexity, and working with those who think differently than you. I won't go into further detail here, but keep them in mind throughout the rest of this talk. Additionally, I will stress that unlike most of our jobs, which require technical, precise, and convergent thinking towards a specific solution, futurism requires creativity, interdisciplinarity, and divergent thinking to dream up different futures that could be. So now we get to the part you've all been waiting for. How do you do this? Well, if comic books have taught us anything, it's the idea of considering different worlds and alternative universes. We don't know what the future will be, so we need to consider a number of different branches. And remember that the present we're living in now is itself a branch of several past possibilities. We may often have a preferred future that we're aiming for, but the purpose of forecasting is to see what we can learn from all possibilities. Scenario planning is one of the oldest and simplest methods used for this purpose. Using this method, we create 4 different possible futures or scenarios based on the outcomes of 2 major drivers, which usually consist of 2 of Sommer's forces. Each quadrant represents the intersection of one of 2 possibilities for each driver. And then we have 4 different possible stories or visions regarding what might happen. Now, let me try it. I envision a scenario in which you're thinking, but is this really helpful? Let's see how right I was. Raise your hand if that's what you're thinking right now. Hey. Well, let me put your minds at ease by showing you a few examples of scenario plans. Here are the Edinburgh scenarios on the future of learning, created over a decade ago. Their drivers center around whether technology becomes a help or hindrance, and whether establishment conventions or self-styled systems drive learning processes and goals. You can see that each quadrant has some summary details about what might happen in that scenario, but don't bother trying to take them all in now. Additionally, they're each given a catchy name so that you can better identify them and get the flavor for that world. Now, imagine that you're in education policy and this is presented to you. How would you start thinking about the future of education? What further research and exploration might you undertake? How would you make decisions differently? These are the Delta scenarios developed by the Department of Transportation. They examined how climate change and economic growth would affect population growth and the general weather. You can see that this one is a lot more dense and specific, but the basic principle is the same. And sometimes people just have fun with it. You can also use scenario planning for your own life by mapping out how the world may shift and identifying what kind of job you want or skills you'd like to develop. The instructions for scenario planning are fairly basic, but because the method is so loose, it can be difficult to figure out what level of rigor is required. Remember, forecasting is the 3rd step in the process, after first framing your issue and scanning your environment, which help to determine the most important scenario drivers and outcomes. Like any good research, you should have sources you can cite to back up the work that you've done and what you've imagined. But that said, don't be afraid to change or update your drivers when necessary. Also, remember that the goal of scenario planning is to move beyond what you'd normally consider, so be sure not to fall into traps where you prioritize what you already know or believe. Futurism is about opening your mind to what you might otherwise miss. Consider, many things about today would have seemed crazy just 50 years ago, so don't be afraid to dream up some really out there and off-the-wall scenarios. Scenario planning is just one of the methods used in futurism. There are actually quite a few of them. They all work differently and have different particular uses, but their goals are the same. Flesh out and imagine how the present will compare to different futures. Additionally, people don't practice futurism in a vacuum. They reach out and connect with each other through organizations like the World Future Society. Now, this is all great, but ultimately, futurism is useless if it doesn't impact our present. What do you do after you've done your forecasting? Well, now is the time when you select a desired scenario, and now is the time to work towards it. There is a methodology in program evaluation called theory of change. You trace backwards from your desired outcome through a series of preconditions and indicators of those preconditions that lead towards it. Then you look for indicators and preconditions of those indicators and preconditions, and so on, until you arrive back at the present. This can also be used for undesired scenarios, so that you can identify the indicators and preconditions that you want to avoid or prevent. Either way, you'll have a clear, step-by-step plan that you can start putting into action today. When you start to seriously contemplate potential futures, it feels like a genie coming out of a bottle. It's a very fun and creative process to imagine both logical and wildly unlikely directions in which our world may head. With the path forward foggy and unclear, it's more important than ever to prepare ourselves and our organizations for any sort of future. Methodologies like scenario planning allow us to look up from our daily grinds and ensure that we never lose sight of what we're working towards. Computer science pioneer Alan Kay said that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And the more attention you pay to what may be coming, the better a chance you'll stand of inventing the future that you want. So just remember that although the future isn't certain and it isn't set, it also isn't mysterious. It's just waiting to be imagined. Thank you.